Good morning. I'm here today with Ian Penrose, the Yarra Riverkeeper. Mr. Penrose, thank you for speaking with me.
It's a pleasure.
Now on to the first question. What is your main role in the Yarra Riverkeepers organisation, and I suppose what's the main purpose of the organisation?
I am the spokesperson for a community group, and they've given me this wonderful title of Riverkeeper, which I think is lovely. What is the community group doing? And we are called the Yarra Riverkeeper Association. We're a group of citizens who believe our waterway, and our major waterway in Melbourne is the Yarra River, is really important to our lives, and that we should be part of the work to protect it for the future. We are part of an international movement of similar community groups called Waterkeepers Alliance, who are saying that we shouldn't be leaving the care of our local environment just to the authorities. We have a major responsibility to be in there as well. And in the urban area, our river is under a lot of pressure, and so as a community we think we can do better.
Definitely. And in your view, what are the major threats to the Yarra and the Yarra catchment in particular?
Okay, there are three dominant threats and one less one. The most obvious one is water pollution, and there are a whole range of ways in which in an urban area we put our waste into the river, from litter at one extreme right through to runoff from our streets and even sewage. Secondly, and less obvious, is because the Yarra is our major source of water supply, we take a lot of water from the river. And so a threat is we take too much and take away the habitat for all the creatures that live in the river. The third threat, a more subtle one, and one that's our campaigning work at the moment, is the health of the banks and the landscape of the river is being destroyed to a large extent by it being taken over by buildings and concrete. So if you like, it's the development of Melbourne as it expands. We're losing some of our very special natural areas, and that's a major threat to the Yarra. And lastly, but less important, we do have some exotic animals and plants, weeds and pest species in the river, but of the threats I'll put them not as a major one at the moment. The media will pick up very much on the pollution issues, and these are important, but I would like to raise attention to the other issues of water extraction, losing water from the river, and losing our riparian, our banks under buildings.
Do you believe the state government's response in the Cleaner Yarra River and Port Phillip Bay Action Plan is sufficient to meet those four threats?
The response by the government to pollution is the right one. Is it adequate to cover all those issues? Not at all. That's not a criticism of the work the government's doing in tackling pollution, and that's what that plan is, the Cleaner Yarra and Port Phillip Bay plan is coordinating all the government work by the authorities to clean up the river, clean up the bay. But as I mentioned, it is only one of the threats to the river, both its social and environmental values as water pollution. It's not tackling the issues of water extraction from the river, and it's not tackling the issue of what you might call visual pollution, losing the banks under buildings and bridges and so forth.
Talking about that increase in urban development and the concrete and more development in these natural areas, there's been a number of, I suppose, increased pressures on that, whether it's a proposal for a North-East link potentially, or increased building development. There was a report released last year by Planning Minister Matthew Guy that talked about increased urbanising of Melbourne's green wedges, but now that seems to have been softened considerably. Do you think the state government could be doing better in that regard in terms of how it manages this increased pressure with population growth and more housing in these natural areas? Is there a better thing that the state government
it could be doing? The government is certainly busy in this area, but it's not doing the right things, I believe. We're not giving enough attention to protecting the natural areas in Melbourne, which is one of the reasons why Melbourne is quite an attractive city and has high livability. We're continually seeing that the planning is about putting in more buildings. When do we stop putting in buildings? Every time we put in a building that replaces trees or grasslands, that is not sustainable. It would be if we were pulling down buildings and putting back parks. But what's happening with planning is we're continually permitting and encouraging more and more buildings, and many of those are destroying the natural values of the land and the natural values of the river corridor. Look, there are many aspects to the planning portfolio, many aspects of planning. Some of the work is not as threatening as one had hoped. I think that the recent announcement on the green wedges is much more benign than people worried. But in other areas, we're squeezing in more buildings, and that is destroying many of the values of our river.
Definitely. Do you think there should be eventually a joint sort of policy involving all the stakeholders together, or is that impossible? Given the competing interests of, say, the building industry, housing, and government, and then environment groups and the community, or is there a vested interest in protecting the river in everyone that everyone should realise?
I would like to think so. Look, I think if when we meet with people, our organisation gives lots of talks and presentations and spend a lot of time listening to the community and the various stakeholders of the river. There isn't a common view out there, but when you share with people the values of the river, what is happening? It's our source of water. It has wonderful wildlife, very special, and in an urban setting that's valuable. It's important to our well-being, those natural things. When you share that, people say, yes, we can do better in protecting it. But in the planning arena, you do have conflicting values. You have the government, which I'm not quite sure what its values are, and that's a question of both parliaments, both sides. I'm not quite sure which way they want to go. They do tend to have these short-term thinkers. But in the development area, you have a conflict, I think, between the people who live in Melbourne, the Melburnians, about wanting to make sure that the facilities and the environment is good for their well-being. And that's not necessarily aligned with those businesses who make money out of putting up buildings, whether they be builders, architects, planners, and the developers themselves. Their livelihood is based on putting up more concrete. And in some instances, that conflicts with the community's desire to protect special areas where it's a natural setting. So there's a conflict out there. I would like the government to spend more time listening to the community's views on what it wants to protect in the long term. And I think the government has a responsibility to address the community's values, not the values of those who want to put in more buildings.
Definitely. And just finally, what's most special about the Yarra River?
Oh,
it's very...
Well, where we are here today,
yes.
We're on the bank. And in fact, after this interview, we might take the camera down to the river itself.
Fantastic.
It is special because it is a place of so many other species. It's habitat for them. Around the rivers, you'll have much more density of wildlife. It's because it's a wet environment. In Australia, you add water and you get life blossom, and that's very clear when you're close to rivers. So it is a place next to where these other creatures live. And I think that we as the intelligent species, I'm not quite sure about being too optimistic there, intelligent species have a responsibility to care for the other species and not to take away their resources, which is what we're doing. So the Yarra is a place for all of us to share. It also has great beauty, and it has great stories to tell. The Aboriginals who lived here for 40,000 years have wonderful stories. The history of European settlement over the last 2 centuries is rich in fascinating and interesting stories. It's also, I think as humans, we need to have time in natural places. It's part of our sort of hardwired to sometimes be walking on the grass, to see the trees, to hear the birds, to go fishing. And the river provides those values in an urban setting, and therefore it is very precious.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I hope that your story here gets lots of people watching it.
Great.
I really do, because the work that journalists do, the work that story writers do, the work that authors do, and photographers and video producers is very important to sharing messages like this. So I'm glad you invited me to speak, because I see you as a vehicle to help the river. If your story goes out, many people see it and comment on it. I've done part of my work, which is to spread news about the river. We have a catchphrase for our organisation. We say we are the voice of the Yarra, because it cannot speak for itself.
Fantastic.
So thank you to you, Richard.
Well, thank you, Mr. Penrose, for speaking with me.